Hello everyone, today we talk about the fundamentals of Roman imperial power in order to understand essentially the system of aristocracies within the Roman domination that were destined also for the sake of our later historical interest to influence deeply the transition from in fact the Roman to the medieval era. And this is really an overlooked aspect that I think the most updated historiography on the Roman Empire has underlined that of course we're talking of Rome today in a much more realistically kind of feudal and clienterly sense than the kind of statalistic democraticistic bias that we have matured towards the Roman republican institutions that truly were republican, but not in quite in the sense in which we intend a republic today, and that made the thing done. I mean, that made Rome in properly at the core and of its expansive capacity and in its transfiguring nature of the communities that were part of it in ways that we have also explained in the playlist on Indo-European history, what was properly at the core of Roman ideology and how it managed to take over the world at the time, starting literally from a city, right, that managed to mold the world at its own image. This is essentially what the empire had achieved. It was recognized worldwide, meaning that was religious and military alike. And in order to explain the basis of Roman power, one must first of all remember the fundamental juridical distinction between freemen within the world dominated by Rome, depending on whether they enjoyed or not, in fact, the Roman citizenship, the Civitas Romana. That, during the course of the 1st century BC, as you know, was extended gradually to all the Italics of the Italian peninsula and to the freemen of Cisalpine Gaul, that is today's northern Italy, and of Sicily, that was not part of Italy historically, and would be sporadically granted eventually also to other people and single collectivities by privilege, up until at the beginning of the 3rd century was extended to virtually all the free inhabitants of the empire with the Constitutio Antoniniana. So in a way, unless you were a slave, if you could speak Latin, you would get that. And this munus, as it was intended properly, that remunerate, even terms like, we'll see it, the municipium, etc., was referred to the concept of munus, that is, at the same time, a duty and a reward, right? And it was connected to the idea that you could essentially partake the Roman imperium, so the moral superiority and faculty of command that had allowed the Romans to take over the world, as long as you served Rome in the same way, so that you demonstrated that you could individually rise yourself to that same level, and therefore you could achieve the full Romanness, right? And this naturally was mediated by the same Roman Empire that had a rather feudal understanding of how the imperium essentially allowed itself to magnanimously to be conferred by on behalf properly of Rome to these other peoples. And mostly we see again this kind of statalistic bureaucratic fashion, but so from the client states to the Roman citizens, this was intended as essentially a supernatural force that emanated literally from Rome in her sacred nature, for allowing the rest of the world to be civilized in the process, right? And and among these Cives Romani, that is properly the Roman citizens, about 4 million of adult males at the beginning of the 1st century AD, among which perhaps not more than 100,000 in the same city of Rome herself, emerged the two supreme social orders that were qualified by a confirmed wealth, thus power, thus the concept of the imperium, and by an official recognition. So we're talking obviously about the senatorial nobility, organized in the Senate of Rome, and the knightly class, the Equites, designated in imperial times by the princeps. Right? These were respectively, in fact, the patres, senatores, and the Equites, and they represented, in many ways, the older ideal of the chieftains of Rome, what had been feudal Rome, in fact, as properly the fathers of the gentes, of the nobiliar families, and literally the knights, the horsemen, that in fact in Rome maintained, in a sense, this privileged status, even, and that's very important to understand properly, the feudal nature of Roman power, given that, differently from the other citizens, the orderly ones that came also from the plebs, etc., they were paid in part their own equipment, their own horses, etc., by the same state, which is in fact typical also of medieval times, of feudal times, and not quite in the sense of citizen soldier that literally, whatever you had to just employ for the war without, in theory, without retribution. Naturally, things had changed from an administrative point of view in practice, but the idea that the knights were above for this kind of sacred military nature of the ancient mounted warrior and the hero in the Roman tradition, etc., was still there. And naturally, the princeps was the medium of with Jupiter, with the celestial glory, that could confer this imperium to both to the Senate and the knights. So in the Senate, you could enter in an ordinary way by cooptation after having held some city magistracies of Rome, to which the Senate preferably elected the sons of senators. Or you could enter it in an extraordinary fashion by imperial deliberation, which naturally became increasingly more frequent at the autocratization of Roman power during imperial times. And this narrow senatorial aristocracy, as you understand, and thus in good measure an hereditary one, by the way, possessed latifundia in all the Mediterranean and alternated or integrated the management of their own riches with literary, philosophical activities at that time of mainly Hellenistic tradition or model, and with the participation under the control of the princeps to the civil and military government of the provinces all over the empire, Italy excluded up to the end of the 3rd century, and so they would share power with the same emperor, and in the same, as we've seen, kind of vassalitic fashion, ideally, because, as you know, part of the empire was actually controlled directly by the emperor. The imperial provinces were the more militarized, or at least the ones with a greater strategic relevance, such as Egypt for the supplies to the grain supplies to Rome, and or the frontier areas where the legions stood. The senators owned, in fact, the senatorial provinces that were instead this enormous, in fact, latifundia, where they literally governed as local lords practically. And their status was, in a sense, they could participate to the civil military government all over the empire, because of course the main offices were all senatorial, right? Except, for example, same Egypt, as we were saying before, was governed by a prefect of equestrian order, so that it had properly to escape a bit of this privatistic drifts for a better central control. This system had fundamentally been established and or perfected by Augustus, right? It had already, of course, taken form during the previous centuries Roman expansion and settlement in foreign provinces, and Italy again was considered kind of like a sacred land where armies could probably not be stationed. The same reason why the Praetorian Guard counted 9 cohorts, because technically it wouldn't make a legion. From an administrative point of view, only, in fact, in the 3rd century, a legion would be stationed. The 4th Scutica, if I'm not wrong, by Septimius Severus on the Albanian hills next to Rome. But the idea is that this core land was the one of the Romano-Italic confederacy that, as we've seen at the beginning of the empire, concentrated also properly the Roman citizenship, and that had largely colonized also the other provinces, military colonies, and literally, also an important demographic impact of some sort. And but the class, let's say, in which the emperor mostly counted and balanced properly power against senatorial force, especially through the formation of the central and peripheral bureaucratic cadres, was the one of the knights, that equestrian ordo, to which you could access only exclusively by, in fact, the princeps' deliberation, as the emperor drew the Equites from the Cives Romani, provided with a safe, steady economic base, so essentially a middle class, also the most entrepreneurial one of the empire, that in fact was owning landed assets, constituting the stable nucleus of the those riches normally fueled also by strong commercial and financial speculations. This went on, from a long time. Like the Equites were often subcontracted many imperial administrative functions in the provinces. The entire world was, let's say, corrupt in practice, as before the contemporary state that somewhat had greater grip and control. And the Equites, in this sense, represented, let's say, you can measure through them, through their strength, through their power, that remained consistent, especially during the 1st, the 2nd century AD. This middle class counterbalancement that the emperors counted pretty much on, because they fundamentally embodied the entrepreneurial element of the Roman community, the one that in fact strived for even acquiring a greater status, and even at some point even entering the senatorial order at some point. So in fact, distinguishing the ambitions of the senators from one of the knights is excessive, right? They all pointed to the top in the same way. It's just that, of course, the Equites did it through other ways. And in general, all the struggle that you see, especially in the 1st century of the empire, etc., with these, also the demonization, especially by Flavian historiography, of the Julio-Claudian emperors, etc., in a sort of tyrannic fashion, was actually a senatorial product, right? Was the idea that, the emperors went insane when they started to touch senatorial prerogatives, while they were actually just trying to counterbalance their luxus and their essentially latifundium stagnating economy that was mostly conservative, didn't want to share and to invest elsewhere. Instead, in fact, even the entire deal, the Roman military expansion was was heavily conditioned by this balance. So, as always, the monarchs generally favor the people rather than the nobility, and this causes tensions that eventually, in fact, arrive also to the top, given that especially the Roman Empire never had, especially in this period, like a officially defined succession system that was indeed source of instability. So if we look, however, at this broader aristocracy, these Cives Romani were probably those who maintained control locally in the cities of Italy, and eventually, by extension of the Roman citizenship, to the generalities of the freemen, with all the aristocracies of all the, say, the cities of the empire. And it's important, in fact, to consider that both in Italy and within the provinces governed by the senators and the knights, the greatest part of the population was framed in relatively autonomous districts administered by the curiae of the cities of which the districts to which the districts headed. It was the municipal system that in the West essentially continued the autonomies of the Italic cities, and the Roman colonies, properly the colonies that Rome had established and controlled. While in the East, this grafted on the traditions of the cities of the Hellenistic kingdoms. This is an important divide because naturally the Latin city, the Italic city, is something else compared to the Hellenic one, right? There were naturally compensations, but also mentally there were very different frames. And the Municipia, in fact, as the cornerstone of Roman districts and administration, the Roman Empire was an empire of cities, right? There weren't, political powers that had their center in the countryside. The senators ruled from the city by having all these immense estates in the countryside. And the city was properly the symbol of Romanity because it was the symbol of Rome itself, right? And especially in the Roman model, so mostly in the western provinces, what you see is that first of all, the Romans founded cities from scratch because aside from the Celtic Oppida that represented some kind of proto-urbanization, fundamentally there weren't cities unless we're talking about some Hellenic or Punic colony. But the idea is that the Romans built literally cities from scratch and everywhere, and these cities were not just other random cities in the Roman mindset. They were an identical copy and basically the same, in fact, vassalic extension of Rome herself, so much that even the smallest city, I don't know, in the Algerian desert, whatever, had to be identical to Rome. Like it had to have the temple of Jupiter, it had to have the forum, the bath, everything had to be there. And there was, right? And the political social functionality of those infrastructure was exactly the same one that allowed the government in these provinces that, by the way, were dramatically committed to the Roman civic duty because they saw that as a quite remunerative, in fact, mean of promotion, as it would happen, and that's how Rome managed to draw this immense moral and material resources from populations that had subjugated but had given the possibility to participate, especially at an aristocratic level, to the same imperial government. And that's the reason why Rome had an empire, say, and I don't know, Greece didn't, because the polis mindset was exclusivistic, was xenophobic. It didn't have they thought essentially that the whole world existed only within the city and outside was just imperfection, right? The Romans had a completely different mindset, and they kind of inflated dramatically even this capacity of fact of cooptation that was understandably the only one that allowed such domination to spread, because and that's where the senators were kind of said more conservative. They would have not liked you to to expand further. That's why in part even our ethnographic bias towards, I don't know, some other populations of provinces, countries were not conquered eventually. It's because the senators didn't want essentially to extend the citizenship there, right? Depicting the Germans kind of rougher than what they actually were, as they were, but still in the sense, okay, there is nothing there we should care about, because essentially they didn't want to share the Senate with some barbarian further. In fact, this is the entire history. If you go through the laws from how the citizenship was given. Think about the social war. I mean, it took an entire war among the same Romani Italics to trigger that step, and then eventually there were issues with Cisalpine Gaul, and then with the other provinces, always the Senate protesting. But at the same time, that's exactly the moment in which the empire prospered and managed to expand further and to consolidate, by the way, and to leave a trace civilizationally that is present macroscopically in the West under everybody's eyes. And so the city was the landmark of Roman civilization in many ways, whereas in the eastern provinces, things were different, because that's where essentially cities had come from, even imitatively by the Italics, for example, that like the Romans were basically arguably the only people who actually began to build cities, as opposed to to I don't know, the Iberians, the Gauls, etc., and for which Rome had emerged, albeit in its own kind of Italic way. Again, it was kind of more tribal mindset, but in this sense also kind of more open-minded at times than the same Greeks. And the Greeks, in fact, would maintain this own kind of idea of themselves as freemen, right, within the Roman Empire. Like, given that the emperors had always provided the Hellenic world with some kind of consideration, right? Sometimes like the sack of Corinth, that didn't really happen, but in the broader vision of imperial power, the model to imitate was Alexander, and therefore this idea that certain communities would just bow to you instead of even needing to use arms, because recognizing your ecumenic and divine power, right, was the main goal. Naturally, there were not just Greeks in the East. There were, think about the Egyptians or other populations that had been habituated historically in the millennia to be under rulers, under monarchs, so that, of course, even the fiercely oligarchic and aristocratic Roman culture was kind of democratic and egalitarian in comparison of, I don't know, the Egyptian one. And it's interesting, in fact, how the same Roman emperors were depicted by the various populations of the empire, right? By the Egyptians like pharaohs, by themselves in Rome as, Cives Romani, first among equals, though, as in fact the princeps title fundamentally meant, right? So this aspect is important because the empire was never like a unique state. Like, the cornerstone of Romanity was based on the idea that the imperium had managed to restore the golden age of the primordial human divinity, and that in fact Augustus had been the restorer of such order after the threat posed by the beast, by the wolf, the darkness of the civil wars that had risked to swallow the entire world into death, and that was in fact embodying himself as Apollo reborn. And so the boreal myth of the Indo-European conquerors that laid in the deepest veins also of the Roman culture. And I insist on the clienterly character, kind of asyllatic character of the Roman domination, because it's as if the other peoples had, as we've seen, partaken, and that was the citizenship, was the formal minimum to such universal power, right? So that everybody could and would live the way they wanted, but still kind of disciplined, right, and controlled by the Roman authority that was hierarchically the highest one in all this system. So the city remains, however, the center, the curiae, from which the local city magistrates were elected, were essentially, as we've seen, a copy of the Roman Senate, socially formed by the magnates, provided with that aforementioned multiple economical base, that humanistic culture, and that decorum in lifestyle that rendered them qualifiable in our language, both as aristocracy and it's a sort of middle class or upper middle class or bourgeoisie, more anachronistic terms. And these elites that administered the municipal districts and economically dominated great part of the rural population gave tone and face to the cities that the archaeologists from centuries make re-emerging from temples, tombs, theaters, amphitheaters, basilicas, the thermae, etc. And this was in the wake of the truest Hellenic, Italic, and also Hellenistic at that point tradition of civic and munific competition, the abergetism, that was essentially the mean through which the same city was literally standing. That is to say, aside from the basic Roman administration, also the security forces paid by the state that constituted a minimal part, but the city was run privately, right? It was these men, these family heads, who fundamentally paid for everything, for the police, for games, for health, for all the services that the people would enjoy, right? People that were in this kind of growing in the centuries, kind of more like a mob, poorer, and through especially the crisis of the 3rd century, etc. This masses would at some point. The cities would decline also because of wars, etc. So they would disperse, but also they would be abandoned in a way by the aristocracies that kind of fled towards their latifundia, starting that process of encapsulation, same Roman villas that transformed into the early medieval cortes, for which instead would be the church, that in part was still senatorial. The episcopal elites, at least, administrating it, were still senatorial origin, and so actually, not too much changed in terms of the of who was in charge, would take care of them in similar ways and continuing fact that the Roman administration where the state had evaporated. But this is relevant because the nature of Roman power in these cities was fundamentally still private, at least in the measure in which the government entrusted these aristocracies, the actual government. And this was true, of course, also for independently from the origin of the aristocracies. I mean, a Gallic lord that already lived in a somewhat kind of quasi-feudal fashion, especially in central southern Gaul, before the Roman conquest, if had not been wiped out by the Romans for whichever reason, because the Romans at some point also killed their own allies, depending on the strategic needs that were required. But generally speaking, they would mostly remain in control of their own communities, and that was easy, right? It was that's how it had happened for the Italics as well. It was essentially local aristocracies were co-opted by the Romans with this gradual extension of also different degrees of citizenship that didn't necessarily have to be the fullest, right? There were differences, and this we'll talk about at some point in greater detail, but that already were the heads of the local communities, right? And therefore, by controlling them, they could essentially continue to strengthen a local, the local magnates and maintain the order in that community as well. So naturally, Roman expansion was carried out through systematic subjugation and fundamentally blackmail, even where you find this great concessions and donations to Rome, like the entire kingdom of Pergamon at some point. Those were, niceties, hypocritical niceties, let's say, for avoiding being razed to the ground, frankly, while Rome was knocking at the door and taking control. But objectively, for ancient standards, one gotta give that the Romans gave at least an opportunity of cooperation every time. I mean, also others would do, but this was systematized by the Romans in ways that objectively no other civilization did, and especially with this pretty clear understanding that everybody could be Romanized, right? That kind of universal spiritual elevation of the individual to the greatness of celestial glory was achievable, right? This is what the same Romans believed about themselves. The same senatorial order was fundamentally in opposition to the plebs. The idea of those powerful aristocrats who were loaded in spiritual force and military capacity had managed, in fact, to even frame the mob in the legions, and by the 4th century, and literally waging, and kind of conferring the imperium through them to them, right? And so guiding them to the conquest, the successful conquest of the world. So the Romans would accept that as a normal reality, as a normal modus operandi, and that's how they achieved again what they did, in ways that. I think that I was thinking about it yesterday while preparing this video, that what also survived in the imperial ideal in Latin-Germanic Europe as opposed to the East, etc., is this universal interconnection. That is to say, in the West, you don't find, in early medieval times, that kind of Byzantine crystallization of a fixed formal culture based on certain absolute indicators that had to remain unaltered, right? The de-Romanization of Western Europe, properly the Latinization of Western Europe, so properly the Romanity stemming from the Italic world, had instead, as we've seen, shared this much more open and universal connection at the same time, interconnection between the same communities, so that also great part of what you see with the Roman Church later on, essentially the coordination of the evangelization of Europe through Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons, etc., was already showing this, idea that at the root there had been something in common that they had all had, and Roman citizenship was part of this. Was this comparticipation? Was this not mere domination, but actually partaking to that same glory and superiority? And so that's also what the Germans, in a sense, inherited from their side when they came to rule in these lands, because they always revered imperial power. They never denied it. They thought that they would be actually the ones who were getting control of at that point, and therefore they assumed also that degree of of grandeur that had identified Rome, and that's true. The thing you can easily see through Charlemagne and the papal crowning, and or the Ottonians and the Romanity of the empire, properly as a formal titling. So something that goes beyond even in there the merely ethnic character of a people, like as it had happened instead in Greece, even though the Hellenic culture in that sense was not much betraying at the roots a similar idea, but rather the fact that the political experiment of the polis, of the city-state, had been, in a sense, rendered possible by surpassing the heroic tradition, right? At least in the aristocratic sense. In fact, instead, this idea of an order, of a hierarchy, of a vassal relation with the conquered and the eventual elevation of the same was much was a and is still kind of a character of Western civilization, narrowly meant, because Western Europe basically went on and still goes on through that by that idea, whereas it's difficult to find, I don't know, in the rest of the world, another culture fundamentally doesn't see itself in that sclerotic oppositional sense to the others. And that's the same reason why the West, in my opinion, achieved what it achieved later on. And I think we owe this as an enormous amount of subtly but still grossly overlooked aspects to Roman civilization per se. And that's why I urge you also to watch that video I made in the Indo-European playlist about the Roman civilization, because there is explained properly in its deeper meaning. Naturally, things change, as you understand, within the same Roman Empire for it to fall in the first place, but even the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and this is what I've been getting to in my over time to looking at that, is fundamentally more than a fall, actually a resurgence of those elements in all the Western provinces, Italy included. We were talking about it yesterday about the Longobards and how fundamentally the cultural Germanization of the Italic peasantry were the same colonists that had ended up as, just working as basically as serfs in the senatorial latifundia, had instead recovered for themselves and had accepted that rather than crushing anything, they had just preserved something that was had been has gone somewhat astray during the moment of the crisis of the empire, and from the Byzantine direction properly had been rejected in the West. That there was a model that didn't reflect their tradition, their ideal anymore. Not that the Byzantine Empire didn't maintain much of Romanity in its truest sense, but it's often overlooked by how much this Romanity was made up of different cultural influences, and indeed what existed in the East in imperial times was in the same part of the same cultural identity that eventually would become what we call, even though improperly, but still from a cultural point of view, meaningfully Byzantine rather than Roman. And the difference that we just exposed between the Roman cities and the Hellenic cities within the same Roman Empire did make a great divide culturally, and it's, in my opinion, very much connected to that, to what happened later as well. And this is an aspect which you see, whenever I had never been very explicit about, say, or critically explicit of some specific authors or scholars that are also very prominent and famous in popular culture today. Think about Mary Beard or others that comment on properly what the Romanity was. That's an incomplete story. That's very often a contradictory story. It doesn't tell the whole thing. It doesn't explain exactly the fact that Rome was not even conceiving in itself in a multiculturalistic way. It was something that transcended in a highly spiritual and religious meaning, properly the concept of the imperium and the military power as a root of universal domination. So it's often explained in a materialistic, mechanistic way that doesn't actually render justice at all, not just to the empire, but to what happened later. Because Mary Beard would stop to the early 3rd century, where everything is happy, everything is fine, and then doesn't even explain what happened later and why, as if, the Romans scored big, and then, yes, but then what, right? Is this a part of, like, there was just the Roman Empire, then history ended, and what did actually the Roman Empire mean for the world entire, even later on? That's something, of course, she's not a medievalist, she's not a, but I presume that the same core of the reasons why Rome was the superior civilization, why it achieved factually what no other civilization had been capable of achieving, especially in that time span and with that basis, which is nothing short of incredible, is such of a frightening incredibly powerful force that you cannot explain through the ways you have been doing normally, right? That are just purely socioeconomical and do not actually tell what was at the core again of Roman beliefs, and not just of Roman belief system, but of a much universal one that the Romans wanted and managed by a certain extent to restore in a kind of a golden age ecumenic fashion. But I will explain myself better because the way I'm realizing that history as being taught to us in schools, it's a complete fiction. Like, it has nothing, it misses completely the single most important aspects of history itself, how simply human communities lived, behaved, believed in it. So it's dramatic, and I hope to make more videos also about Roman history in the future to stress this aspect, because it's really worth expanding on for the future, right? And for not losing the moral compass in a time like today, where seemingly everybody has lost it, right? There's not a single force in the world today by a quantitative dimension, like both liberals and conservatives, that actually knows anything about what is going on today in the world, exactly because they have no idea of what history has been, because nobody told them. Nobody, right? There is not a consistent, not even about being niche. There is something beyond. It's almost like a initiatic dimension that, again, in the political debate today, from north side, you can't find. So flattering yourself to fit in the bigger box, whatever, it's left or right, it's nothing to be proud of. It's actually a pretty serious symptom of moral, cultural, and civilizational underdevelopment. And it's the same actual idea that in the ancient religions, in the European ones that we've seen also, especially in the Saint Roman one, was understood as the idea that the world would go down, would decay if you don't keep it running. And there is also a tragic destiny in it all, like in the Germanic religion, which is most evidently so. But it was understood by everybody, literally by everybody, by the Egyptians, by the Israelites, by all the great past civilizations, that there was that course, and that actually we're already in the latter age, right, in the most decadent one. In any case, in this apocalyptic way, I stop it here for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. See you next time. Bye.